3D sculpting is both a fun and intuitive way to create characters in 3D. This class is designed to teach you all the essential 3D sculpting skills you'll need to get started.
Hello, my name is John Knowles. I'm a character animator and animation director, and I've been lucky enough to work in children's television for the last 15 years.
Over the years, I've animated many characters, but I especially love bringing designs of my own to life. 3D sculpting offers a fast and intuitive way to translate a character design into 3D, either for use within an animation or as a standalone illustration. In this class, I'll be covering everything you need to know as a beginner taking your first steps in 3D sculpting, and then together we'll create this fun seahorse character and underwater environment. At its most basic level, 3D sculpting is very accessible, but it also comes with a number of complexities which can create confusion for beginners. To start with, even the number of available brushes can be overwhelming. And then there are the technical elements, such as dynamic topology and remeshing to understand. I'll be covering everything in this class in a logical way, which gradually builds in complexity as you gain knowledge and confidence with the various tools. We'll start out by sculpting a simple rock to get comfortable with the basic concepts. Once that is complete, we'll move on to sculpt two different types of coral, which will each introduce additional tools and techniques. You'll then be ready to put your new skills to use as we sculpt this cute seahorse character. Finally, we'll bring all the elements together to assemble our final scene and render the end result.
This is a beginner level class using the free 3D software application Blender. Now, if you're new to Blender, you may want to check out my Blender Essentials class, which will teach you everything you need to know to get started.
By the end of this class, you'll have all of the skills necessary to start sculpting simple characters of your own. So, if you're ready,
let's get started. Hello and welcome to the class. When it comes to character modelling, there are a number of different approaches that we can take.
Traditional box modelling is great for simple characters, but if you're working on a more complex design, then that's when 3D sculpting really comes into its own. When 3D sculpting, we don't really need to worry about many of the technical aspects often associated with other modelling methods. This makes it far more intuitive and approachable, since it's very similar to pushing and pulling a lump of real clay. That said, there are plenty of things to learn, and I've designed this class in a structured way to ensure that you're able to get sculpting straight away and gradually build up to work on more complex designs. We'll start out by sculpting a rock to learn the absolute essential tools and cover some of the important principles which you'll need to be aware of. We can then move on to working on some coral. This is a really fun and simple exercise which introduces a number of additional tools and techniques and provides plenty of practice. Once you're comfortable with all of the basics, we'll then put your new skills into practice by working on the seahorse character. I've provided my character design for you to work with if you're following along, or you can always make use of your own design instead. Finally, we'll bring everything together to create a finished illustration and render the end result. Since this class is focused on sculpting, I've also provided a file for you to download, which includes the lighting setup to make things a little bit easier. Whilst it is technically possible to sculpt with a mouse, to really enjoy 3D sculpting and get the most out of this class, it would be very helpful to have some sort of graphics tablet with a pressure-sensitive stylus. This will enable you to vary the radius or intensity of your strokes as you're sculpting. Whilst I do use a screen-based tablet, this is not a requirement at all, and I've very happily used a regular graphics tablet for many, many years. Of course, if you're just starting out and don't have access to a tablet, by all means give sculpting with a mouse a try. If you enjoy it, you can always invest in a graphics tablet later. If you're working with a mouse, I'd simply suggest reducing the strength of your brush and then applying multiple strokes to build up volume. This will help you to better control the end result. For your class project, I'd love to see your finished rendered seahorse, or alternatively, if you've created a scene based around your own design, I'd love to see that too. Also, if you're following along with me, please don't feel that you have to copy things exactly. Feel free to use your own imagination to put the techniques I'm teaching into practice with your own unique spin.
Once you finish, be sure to upload your project to the class project gallery so that you can receive feedback and share your work with the others in the class. Also, if you'd like to receive feedback along the way, feel free to upload work in progress to the class project gallery, or alternatively, you can always ask questions in the class discussion section. Now, if you're ready to get started, let's jump into the first lesson.
When we open up Blender with the intention of doing some sculpting, there are two different ways in which we can start. We can create a standard general file type, but we can also start with a sculpting file instead. So if we click on Sculpting under the new File menu, that will then take us into this workspace. This is a dedicated workspace designed to get started with sculpting as quickly as possible. You can see up at the top we have both the sculpting and shading tabs, but we're missing most of the other tabs that would normally be present in the general scene file type. If we click on the plus icon, we can still add in any of these other workspaces if we need to. Other things that you'll notice are, instead of having a default cube, we have this default sphere, and we're also already in sculpt mode. We can still access our object and edit modes, but by being in sculpt mode already, we can get straight to work. Over on the left here, you can see our toolbar, and this has all of our sculpting tools available. There are even more down at the bottom, and just by holding the middle mouse button and dragging up and down, we can see all of the tools that are available. Additionally, you can grab on the boundary here and drag that out, and then that will allow you to see more of the tools on screen at once. Additionally, if we drag this out even further, we'll get one long list again, but we'll have the names of all of the brushes, which can be really useful when you're just starting out and wondering what each of them does. By default, we have this draw brush enabled. And if I just draw over the surface of the sphere here, you can see that we start to add some detail to it. As usual, I can hold down the middle mouse button here to rotate around this sphere. I can hold Shift to move my view, and then either use the mouse scroll wheel or hold down Control and middle mouse to move in and out. Now up at the top here, you can see that we have some brush settings. So for our draw brush, we can adjust our radius of our brush here and the strength. You'll notice next to each of them we have this little icon, which indicates whether pressure sensitivity is enabled. So at the moment I have a fixed radius, but pressure sensitivity will affect the strength of my brush. This means that I can press gently or hard to affect the intensity of my brush stroke. Obviously I can swap these around, and then I can create a brush stroke with a taper on it. I'm just going to swap those back. Rather than going up here and adjusting these radius and strength values up at the top, there's a better way to interact with your brush. If you hit the F key and then move your brush side to side, we can interactively adjust the size of our brush. If I hit F, I can take that down to a much smaller brush size. And then to adjust the strength of our brush, we just hit Shift F. And again, we have this interactive option. And you can see up at the top of the viewport that that's adjusting the strength there as well. So if I bring that up, I'm going to get a more intense stroke, and then hit Shift F to bring it back down again. There are a range of other different options here that we can play around with to affect how our brushes perform. This is much the same as adjusting brush parameters in an application such as Photoshop. In fact, we have some of the same parameters such as the spacing here. Another place to get access to any of these brush parameters is over here in the Properties panel. If we just click on this tool icon up at the top here, you can see our currently selected brush and a representation of the effect that it will have on the mesh. And then we can access any of its parameters down below here. For example, if I roll out the stroke section here, we again get the spacing options that we had up at the top here. And just to show how this works, if for example I was to adjust this spacing and drag this up, you can see as I drag over the surface, I actually end up with a number of individual dots. By reducing the spacing back down, we are actually creating those individual dots close together, which gives us the impression of a brush stroke. This can be useful if you want to get different effects as you're sculpting. I'll reset that back to 10 for now. So far we've been drawing on the surface of the mesh and it's been pushing the geometry up. Up at the top here you can see this plus and minus icon. If I hit on the minus icon and draw on the surface, we'll actually push the geometry down. That can be very useful, but there's an easier way of achieving the same result. If I change this back, so that as we draw on the surface we're pushing up the geometry, I can now hold down the control key, and then as I draw on the surface it will actually push the geometry back down again. The other modifier key which works with all of the brushes, which you need to be aware of, is holding down the shift key. If I just increase my brush size a little bit here, using the F key, and then I hold down shift, I can actually smooth out an area. I can then redraw on the surface, maybe smooth over the one side of it, and that can be really useful. The other brush that I'm going to introduce in this introduction here is the grab brush. You can see it on the left hand side here in yellow. If we enable that brush, and I'm just going to increase my brush size again with the F key, we can actually make larger changes to our mesh. Just going to make it a bit bigger. And then we can make some global changes and push and pull parts around. This is really useful and we'll be using that a lot when we're sculpting. Again, we can adjust its size if we want to make finer adjustments to a shape. And we still have access to that smoothing option just by holding down the shift key, so that we can polish up any parts of the mesh that we want to. So if you're following along, I would suggest you just spend a little bit of time playing around with the draw brush and the grab brush, getting used to adjusting that brush size and strength, using the control key to invert your brush, and smoothing things out by holding down that shift key. Moving around your mesh, getting used to seeing it from all angles. And then once you feel confident, you can move on into the next lesson and we'll start to build the first elements of our scene. We're now ready to get started with building our scene, and we're going to start out by building one of the rocks that will form part of the background. You'll notice that I've opened up Blender here, but instead of opening it in sculpting mode, I've opened it with a general scene file to start with. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, because we're going to be creating an entire scene with multiple elements, having access to all of these different workspaces will make our lives a lot easier as we progress with the rest of the scene. Additionally, it will allow me to highlight a number of elements that you need to be aware of when you start out sculpting for the first time in Blender. Within the default sculpting file that we tried out in the previous lesson, we had a sphere already created for us. In this case, however, we're going to start out with the default cube that comes in with a general scene file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over into the sculpting workspace, and you'll see that this looks very similar to what we just had when we created the sculpting scene file to start with. But again, we have the benefit of all of these additional workspaces. What you'll notice though, is with my draw brush selected, if I now try to draw on the surface of this cube, nothing appears to happen. That is until I go over any of the corners here. Then I'm able to move that corner around with the draw brush. I'm just going to hit undo to get rid of that. Now the reason for this is, by default, this cube doesn't have much geometry. And we can see that if we head over into the modeling workspace. You can see we have vertices or points on each of these corners, whereas the sphere that existed for us in the sculpting workspace had already been subdivided so that there was a lot more geometry to work with. What this highlights is the fact that within the sculpting mode, really all we're doing is moving points around, but we do that with the sculpting brushes rather than the other modeling tools within Blender. So in order to sculpt on a surface, we need to increase the amount of geometry or the number of vertices within a particular mesh. Now to do that, here in the modeling mode here, so that we're in edit mode, we can just right click on the mesh and hit subdivide. And I'm going to do that a couple more times so that I have a bit more geometry to work with. Now if we jump over onto the sculpting workspace, you can see again it's changed us back to sculpt mode automatically. But with this draw brush selected, if I draw on the side, you can see I'm now starting to move these points around. And you can see where all of those points are because we have a relatively low resolution mesh still. Again, I'm just going to hit undo to return back to our default cube shape. And now we're going to start sculpting the basic shape of our rock. So I'm going to change my brush now over to the grab brush that we were using before. Now you can either click on it down here in the toolbar, or you can hit G on the keyboard to jump over into the grab tool. Now within Blender, G is normally grab to move an object when we're in object mode, but the same shortcut can be used for this grab tool within the sculpting mode. So I'm just going to increase the size of my brush here, and I'm just going to start forming the basic shape of our rock. And I'm going to pull this down a little bit and maybe increase my brush size a bit just so that I can change the overall shape a little bit. I'm trying to create something that looks like a long flat rock. I'm just getting the right basic shape to start with. It's going to be fairly stylized, not going for something that's super detailed at all. So that's a better overall shape to start with. I'm just going to reduce my brush size so that I can round out that shape just a little bit more. I still want to keep a little bit of this rectangular shape to it. I don't want it to be softened up too much. Remember, we can hold down the shift key to smooth things out, and you'll see that that really rounds things out quite a bit. I'll do that down at the bottom. But the intensity of that smooth is just a little bit too much for me. Now, the strength value that we have up here at the top is for our grab mode. But if you look down in your tools down at the side here, the top tool in this section is the smooth tool. Now if we enable that, we can actually reduce the strength of this smooth tool. And I'm just going to drop that down to 0.2. Then when we return to our grab brush here, if I try to smooth by holding down the shift key, you can see that the effect of that smoothing is far lower. So I'm just softening the edges a little bit, but still keeping this overall shape. And what you'll notice is, as I'm smoothing, we can see how the geometry is being pulled around. Each of these points is being moved to smooth out the shape. I can always adjust things a little bit with my grab brush again, just to create a pleasing overall shape to start with. I want to flatten out the bottom a little bit. So let's move some of this down. Doesn't have to be exact. We want something that feels organic rather than too artificial. And soften that a little bit with the smooth tool. There we go. So that's a good overall starting point, I feel. Now, if we want to actually sharpen up some of these edges, we can do that with a different brush. So just here above the grab brush, we have the pinch brush. And if I reduce my brush size a bit further, let's zoom in a little bit too, so we can see what's going on. As I drag across one of the edges here, you can see it starts to pull our vertices together, and this will have the effect of sharpening up this edge a little bit. And we can do that around the top here as well, maybe a little bit down one of these sides. We don't have an awful lot of geometry to work with at the moment here. So what we can do is just jump back into the modeling mode here, and then with all of our vertices selected, if they're not selected at all like this, you can just hit A to select everything, and then right click and hit subdivide. and that will give us a bit more geometry to play with. Again, I'm going to jump back into sculpting mode here, and as well as the pinch brush here, what I often like to make use of is the crease brush, which you'll find in this at the bottom of this blue section. Now with the crease brush, I just adjust my brush size a little bit, that will let us introduce creases where, as we paint on the surface, it's pushing this geometry in a little bit. But in addition to that, we can actually invert the brush. So by holding down the control key and dragging over the surface, like with the pinch tool, we're pulling things together. So that can be really useful, having the two functions in one brush. Now that we've defined the main shape of the rock, we'll go ahead and add more detail in the next lesson. So another brush which is really useful with defining the shape of this rock is the scrape brush. And you'll find that just down here in this red section. So this brush enables us to actually flatten out sections of our mesh, so we can start to create larger planes on the surface. And you'll notice this more if I start to work on one of these corners perhaps. So if I flatten out this section here, then you can see that we've created this nice shape in here, as if a section of the rock has been chiseled away. And I'm just going to use this in a few places just to get some different, more interesting shapes into the rock, make it feel more like it's aged and weathered and broken up over time, but also to flatten out some of these sections and give us some more interesting planes to work with. And again, I can make use of this crease brush. Let's just reduce our size a little bit, and just again inverting it with the control key, just create some edges here. Softening things as we go in places, sharpening up some edges, softening others to create a more interesting shape. Again, I'm going to go back to this scrape brush and just chisel away on some of these edges to create these more interesting shapes. Now obviously our view at the moment is very faceted. If we head back to the layout mode here, so that we're back into object mode, we can actually right click on a mesh here and select shade smooth. That will give us a better representation of what the end result is going to be. So if we jump back into sculpting mode, then we can start looking at these shapes a bit more closely and flattening out sections to create these nice sharper edges. Again, if you feel that there is not enough geometry there, we can always subdivide this one step further. It's always best to work with lower geometry to start with to get the overall shape in place, and then start refining it and adding the extra detail as it's required. Now you can see the top here is a little bit lumpy, so I'm just going to hold down my shift key and smooth some of that out a little bit. But I do want to create some of these obvious planes in here. So again, just by making use of this scrape brush, moving around to different angles, I can start to harden up some of those edges. Let's maybe make use of that crease brush again, adjusting my brush size and inverting the brush so that I can create some sharper edges in here perhaps. Sharpen up that one and smooth out some of the bumps. and just move around the rock, just trying to create something that feels interesting and organic. So you've got some nice obvious faces to it, so it's got that stylized feel. But really it's up to you how realistic you want to take the end result. So I'm just smoothing out these lumpier bits that have been introduced as we added the extra geometry in there. Same underneath here. Just holding down Shift key and smoothing over the surface. Now this is looking a little bit too flat here, so I think again I'm just going to maybe add in a little bit more of a shape here. So just holding down the Control key again with that crease tool just to create an edge there. And where we've actually pushed the geometry up a little bit here, we can actually use another tool down here, which is the fill tool. So if I increase my brush size a little bit, that will actually add in some geometry to the sides here to help bulk out that shape, and that helps create these more obvious planes. I'm going to revert to the scrape tool again here, just to really harden up that shape. Same here. Chisel out the corner a little bit here, just for a bit more interest. And again, let's see if we can create something different here. Moving around the mesh, just create some of these more interesting shapes. And take the size of this brush down again, still with this scrape tool, and just chisel away at some of these corners again. Oh. We'll have to sharpen up the edges on that a little bit. So again, I'm going to use my crease tool inverted just to give me some sharper shapes there. There we go. This is a little bit too even, so I'm just smoothing out some of it, keep some a bit more creased, some a bit softer, so it feels like that edge tapers a little bit more naturally. And I think I'm going to crease across here. Been lost a little bit. There we go. Smooth that bit out a little. Same over here. Just moving around, adding little bits of detail where it feels appropriate, until you're happy with the overall shape. This is a really good exercise for getting used to all of these brushes. Because being able to create these defined planes will become very useful as we go forwards into actually sculpting a character. So that looks fairly good. I'm pretty happy with that. And I think there's just a little bit of housekeeping that we need to do now. So first of all, I'm going to go up into the outliner here and change the name from cube to rock. And then I want to add a simple material to it. So I'm going to head down to the materials tab here in the properties panel. We have a default material here already, but I'm going to rename that to rock. And I'm going to enable my material preview up at the top here so that we can see exactly what we're doing. So this base color, I'd like to go in and change that. I'm just going to darken that right down to start with and just push the colour slightly into the blues. So we're getting a slightly more blue-grey colour in here. At the moment, this rock is very shiny though, so I'm going to up the roughness as well. Somewhere towards 0.85, there or thereabouts. And that just gives us a little bit of a flatter look. So I think we can leave that there. And we're just going to save our scene file now. So I'm just going to go save as, and you can save this wherever you like. And I'm going to call my file Seahorse version 1. Obviously it's just a rock at the moment, but we'll be adding all of the other elements within this same scene file. So I'm just going to hit save as. Then whenever you're ready, we can jump into the next lesson where we'll start sculpting our first piece of coral. For our first piece of coral, we're going to create a branching type of coral known as staghorn. Before we start, I'm just going to change my viewport shading back to solid, and then I'm going to jump into the layout tab. We can hide our rock here, and I'm going to create some base geometry to work from. Now I'd like to work with a sphere as our base, so if we hit Shift A, we could add in a UV sphere here, but you'll notice at the top of the sphere, all of the edges converge to a single point. This can lead to some issues when you're sculpting, and it's better to start with some cleaner geometry. So in order to do that, I'm going to just hit X to delete the sphere, and I'm going to add in a cube once again. This time, rather than heading into the modeling tab and subdividing the geometry there, I'm actually going to add a subdivision modifier. And the quick way of doing that is to hold down the Control key and type one of the numbers up above the letter keys on your keyboard. So I'm going to hit Control and 4 to add a subdivision modifier with 4 levels of subdivision. If we go into the properties panel here and look at the modifier properties, you can see that we now have 4 levels of viewport subdivision. The problem is we can't sculpt on this as it is at the moment, because that geometry hasn't actually been committed to the mesh. And you can see that if we head over into the modeling tab, we still only have these base points to work with. So what we can do is actually apply this modifier. And in order to do that, we actually need to head back into object mode. So if we go back to our layout tab, that takes us automatically back to object mode. And now we should have this option available to apply the modifier. Equally, you can just roll over the top of this modifier and hit the Control A keyboard shortcut. Now, if we head back into the modeling tab, you'll see that all of these points are now available to us. With that done, let's just head into the sculpting tab. And we can start to work with this mesh. The first thing I'd like to do is pull out some branches from this sphere. Now there's a very handy tool down here called the snake hook tool, which will allow us to do that. If I just increase my brush size a little bit here, you'll be able to see how this works. If I click on the geometry and start pulling up, you'll see that we can actually drag this all the way out. But as we do so, we're actually stretching the geometry that was there originally. We don't have enough points on the mesh in order to stretch this out as far as we're trying to. Now, I could go back and subdivide the mesh further, but we don't actually want any additional subdivision down at the bottom here. What we want is to subdivide locally where we're stretching out the geometry. And there's a tool in Blender that will allow us to do that. So if I just hit Ctrl Z to undo, what we need to do is go up and enable this Dyne Topo mode. That will dynamically add topology, additional points to the mesh as we're working. So first need to check this on, and you'll probably get this warning, and that's absolutely fine. So just click OK. And then we have a number of different options within this dropdown. By default, Dyne Topo uses this relative detail mode. And in order to show how this works, I'm just going to switch back to our draw brush. And what this means is that Blender will add geometry as you're working on the mesh, but the amount of geometry, the resolution of that geometry, will change as we get closer or further away from the mesh. So to illustrate that, if I start to paint here, you'll notice that the mesh has become triangulated and it's become lower resolution. If I just undo that and move in, and I paint here, you'll notice that we've got a lot more detail. If I were to zoom even further in, I can start painting smaller details over the top here, and additional geometry is added in exactly where it's required. Now the downside of this is if I now zoom out and try to make some changes here, I lose all of my detailed sculpting that I was doing when I was zoomed in. And if I zoom out even further, the problem gets worse. So I'm just going to undo that again, go back to our base mesh. So there's a different way of working with this. This relative detail mode can be very useful, but when you're starting out, it's helpful to change to constant detail mode. That way, it doesn't matter how close we are to the mesh, we'll always add the same amount of detail. Now by default, you'll see that the actual resolution is very low. So instead, we're going to change this resolution value from 3, and I'm initially going to increase that to 20. Now as we start to paint, you'll see that we're adding plenty of extra geometry there for our needs, but if we zoom in, we're simply adding at the same resolution, and the same if we zoom out. So again, I'm just going to undo that, and we can go back to our snake hook tool, and we'll start to drag out some branches in the next lesson. So the best way to work with the snake hook tool is to drag out in small amounts and to keep moving around the mesh. Initially, I'm just going to drag out a few lumps on the top of this mesh to indicate the base of the branches. Maybe we have another one coming out here and one up in the middle. Once we've got this base, we can start moving around and pulling out each of these branches a little bit more. Just taking it slowly and moving around to make sure that we are pulling things out in the direction that we want. If, for example, I was to drag this out too quickly, we can see that it's getting very thin quite quickly. That can be useful sometimes, but for the moment, I want to try and keep these a little bit fatter. And have a bit more control over where they're going. And that gives us a good starting point. Now, you'll still see that we start to lose some of the thickness here. And I want to fatten up all of these a little bit. And we can do that with the inflate brush. You'll find that over here. And if we use that and just paint over the surface, you can see that it's increasing the thickness of each of these branches. So I'm just going to go around and fatten everything up a little bit. So we've got some nice thick branches to work with as our base. I'm just pulling that down a little bit towards the base of this sphere as well. I want to create a more natural organic shape. I don't want it to appear as if these branches are sticking out the top of a sphere. And we can also use our grab brush again, just increase the size of that to give us a more natural base to work from. So I'm going to squash up the bottom a little bit. Again, always moving around the mesh to make sure that things are looking good from all angles. And remember, we want something nice and organic. We don't want this to be symmetrical at all. So just pulling these points in a little bit, roughly flattening things out at the bottom. It doesn't have to be exact, so we'll adjust that to fit on some of the rocks later on. And you can always, again, hold down the shift key to smooth out areas if you want to, just to blend out some of these edges. Again, if that smooth is not sufficient for you, then we can jump over to our smooth tool and once again increase that strength value, and that will allow us to smooth that a little bit more. It's useful while we're just trying to get this basic shape up and running here. Okay. I'm going to adjust that strength back down again and return to my snake hook tool. And let's start pulling these branches out even more. If you start to lose volume, again, just head back to the inflate tool and you can just hit the I key. That's the shortcut for the inflate tool, which will let you jump back there quickly and easily. And then if you want to return to your snake hook tool, the shortcut for that is K. Once you've started to get these out to a reasonable length, we can think about bringing out some of the branches from them. So I'm just going to reduce the size of my snake hook tool a bit and just drag out from the side here. And just flicking out to the side will give us these nice little spikes here. And again, try to do that in a random way. If they're a little bit too thin, again, hit I to head back to the inflate tool and you can thicken them up a little bit. K to pull it out a little bit further. Again, keep moving around, smooth things out where you need to. Maybe add in a little bit of thickness here. The inflate tool and K to head back and start pulling out some more of these branches. And just pulling them out in random directions, whatever feels good to you. So that we create something that's natural and organic feeling. Put something out in the middle here. See, I've squashed this up a little bit here, so I'm just going to undo that, and I want to inflate this a little bit more with my I key, just so that I've got a better base to drag things out from. Just going to inflate it a bit more down at the bottom here as well, just increase my brush size a bit so that this feels a bit more natural and all of these branches seem to grow out from the same sort of area. Just going to smooth that slightly so that we don't start having the geometry overlapping there at all. But I want to bridge these gaps a little bit. So that's looking a little bit better. So again, K to go back to my snake hook tool. Just going to hit F to reduce my size a bit. And again, start pulling out some branches here. It's a little bit small, so let's inflate it. And again, okay, let's make that a little bit bigger. Okay, again, let's inflate this a bit. There we are. And we can just keep going, adding little spikes and branches until we're happy with the end result. Since I'm just repeating the same steps over and over, I'm just speeding up this section of the class slightly. As you're creating your own coral, there's no need to follow along exactly with what I'm doing. It's really just a case of experimenting and having fun. constantly rotating the model so that you can see things from all angles, and dragging out branches with that snake hook tool. Remember, you can always jump between your snake hook, inflate and grab brushes to refine the shapes, and you can also smooth things by holding down that shift key as you go. And you see here that things are a little bit fatter in the middle here, thinner down below, so I'm just going to inflate that just to even things out a little. Again, we're just pushing and pulling the general shape around with the grab brush. Now, I'm not too happy with what's going on down at the bottom here. We've got this little point sticking out here, which is not smoothing out very well. So what I'm going to do is head over to my scrape tool and see if that will help us flatten it out. And it does. There we are. And I can still smooth now over the top of that and get a cleaner result. Do the same over here. Well, there's some other artifacts that I didn't like the look of. Moving around, I'm just going to go to my grab tool again, flatten this out a bit more. Once again, I'm just going to time-lapse this section as I add the final few branches and make some general tweaks to the overall shape. I'm just trying to create a form which looks as good as possible from all angles so that we can then reuse the coral throughout our scene. Finally, I'm going to refine the base shape here just to make it feel a little bit more natural. Again, checking all of the angles to make sure I'm happy with the direction of the branches so that this will look as good as possible from any angle in our final scene. Okay, so once you're happy with that, we can again rename this. So I'm just going to go up to the outliner and call this Coral Staghorn. And as we did with the rock, I'm also going to add a material down here. So since there's nothing defined by default, I'm just going to hit new. We'll call this Coral Staghorn as well. And for now, I'm just going to add a simple base color. And we can always enable our material preview there, just so we've got an idea of what we're adding in here. And I think for the Staghorn coral, I'm going to go with something a bit more muted like this. That should do us for now, and we'll refine these materials a little bit later. So we can just hit Control S to save our scene, and then we can move on and work on another type of coral in the next lesson. The second type of coral we're going to work on is a tubular variety. So we're going to start out in a similar way to last time, and again I'm just going to go back to my standard flat viewport shading, head into the layout tab. We can hide this coral, and I'm going to hit Shift A to add in a cube as our base. Again, I'm going to hit Control and 4 to apply this subdivision modifier, and roll over here and hit Control A to apply it. With that done, we can head back into our sculpting tab. And again, I'm going to make use of this snake hook tool to allow us to pull out the base tubes that we're going to be working with. So I'm just going to once again increase my brush size and just start pulling things out a little bit to give us a base to work from. I'm actually going to broaden out the shape a little bit as a starting point. So it'll give us a more natural base here right from the start. Again, just moving around so I can see things from all angles. Okay, once we've done that, I'm just going to reduce my brush size a bit and start dragging things out. So again, let's just create some smaller lumps on the surface to act as our base. And again, before we start dragging these things out too far, we're going to have to enable our Dyn Topo mode. So let's turn that on, say OK to the warning, and just double check our settings in here. So again, we're still at constant detail with a resolution of 20. So now when I start to drag these out, I've got that extra resolution in there to work with. Let's just bring these out a little bit, give us a starting point. And I'm just going to smooth that off a little bit here in the middle where we've got those joins. And I also want to inflate these a bit, so hitting I to inflate. Because in this case, I really want to get some nice fat tubes that almost butt up together with each other. And we're just going to move between our snake hook tool and inflate tool as we're going on. Just increase that size a little bit and start to pull these up. Just checking around so that we don't get any of these strange shapes in here. Jump back to inflate again and push these out. Again, just make use of your grab tool when you need to make some larger overall changes. Let's pull these up a bit further. Going back to inflate. And as before, I'm just going to inflate things a bit at the base to pull them together. And keep adjusting that brush size with the F key just to make sure you've got the optimal size for whatever you're working on at any point in time. Just once again grabbing and pushing things in. And that's a bit of smoothing. And I want to inflate the top of these quite a bit. Just smoothing out that lump there, which pulls it back towards the rest. evening up the shape of these tubes here. Just my inflate tool again. And dragging that down to make it feel integrated with the base as well. Just a little bit of smoothing to help. Use my grab tool and putting this down a little bit. It's getting a little bit higher than I wanted it to be. I'm trying to have these at a fairly even height overall. Okay. I think that will do us for the base mesh here, and we'll go ahead and add the remaining details in the next lesson. The next thing that I want to do is start working on the tops of these. And we're going to use the masking tool for this. So you can hit the M key to jump into the masking tool. You'll find it down at the bottom here. And then I'm just going to reduce my brush size a little bit. And what I want to do is just paint a circle onto the top of each of these tubes. And the masking tool just allows us to identify parts of the sculpt that we want to work on or not be able to work on. So at the moment, these areas I wouldn't be able to sculpt on, whereas I could sculpt on the rest of the mesh. What I actually want to do is invert that now, and we can do that by hitting Control I. You can see, obviously, we're now able to work just on these tips. Now, what I'd like to do is to actually push these tips in. So we're creating a dip in the top of each of these tubes here. Now, I could start sculpting on each of these individually, but there's an easier way to do that. And in order to do that, we're going to use what's called a mesh filter. And you'll find that down the list here. And it's actually this icon here. So if I click on that, that gives us a number of different things that we can do to affect the entire mesh, or in this case, the areas of the mesh that are not masked out. So in this case, what I actually want is this inflate option. Now, if I just click and drag on screen, you'll see we're pushing the ends of this out. But if I drag this back in the opposite direction, we can actually push those back inside. And it's a quick way of having an effect on multiple areas all at once. The other thing we can do is adjust this mask slightly. So what I want to do is just hit the A key, and that will bring up this pie menu here. And now we can adjust the size of this mask. So what I'm actually going to do is choose to shrink the mask, which will expand it away from that area that we've been working on. And I'm going to do that one more time as well. And then I'm actually also going to choose to smooth this mask. And that will just soften the edge slightly as well. Now with this inflate tool still active, I'm just going to click and drag again and just further round out the top there until I'm happy with it. Now you can see there's a little bit of pinching in the middle of each of these, but that's absolutely fine because I can just hold down the shift key to smooth over the top, but I will need to be back in one of my other tools to do so. So for now I'm just going to revert back to my grab tool, and I can just hold down the shift key and smooth over the middle, just so that we're not getting that pinching right in the center there. There we are. Now I'm going to invert the mask once again, just by hitting Control I. And now I'm actually going to go to my inflate tool by hitting the I key, just increase the size a little bit. And now I'm going to just paint around the top edge of this and inflate around these areas. That will give me a nice sort of rounded, puffy top to the end of each of these tubes. Smooth it out where you need to as well. Just holding down the shift key. Create a nice end result. And I'm just going to move around each of these. Now I'm not obviously using the mesh filter in this case for the inflate, because that would inflate everything in the mesh, and we just want a localized effect just around the top of each of these tubes. Just getting rid of that harsh edge and giving a bit more thickness to the top of this tube. Just smoothing that out again. There we are. So a bit more thickness to that one, I think. Smooth things out. There we are. And when you're happy with that, we'll need to clear that mask. And again, you do that just by hitting the A key to bring up this pie menu here, and then we have a clear mask option. And click on that and get rid of the mask. So I'm just going to take a second just to smooth out some of these areas at the bottom here that were looking a bit lumpy. Now this area here that's got these lumps and bumps, a little bit harder to smooth. So again, I'm just going to jump over into my scrape brush, drop the size a little bit, and let's just scrape down here and just smooth that out just to help even things out a little bit. There we are. And once again with my grab brush, just going to adjust the base slightly so I'm a bit happier with how that's going to sit on the rocks. Since these changes are all very repetitive, I'm just going to add a short time lapse and we'll return to real time when we're done. All I'm really trying to do here is to adjust the shape of the base with the grab tool until I'm happy that it flows nicely into the tubes and feels like it's part of a natural form which might attach to the rocks below. Okay, I think that will do. So let's once again, I'm going to jump into my layout mode and I'm going to rename this. So coral tubular, and we'll add a material again, just give that the same name and set a base color for it. Okay, let's just have a look at how things look in material preview. So I'm going to set a brighter color here. Let's just drop that down a little bit. And that will do us again as a starting point. So there we are, we have our base rock and coral defined. So let's just save our scene and then we can move on and start sculpting our character in the next lesson. Since we're now ready to start working on our seahorse, it seems like the perfect time to version up our scene file. This is something that I do from time to time, so that if ever a scene gets corrupted for any reason, or we accidentally make any destructive changes, we always have a safe place to go back to. So I'm just going to go up to File, Save As, and then I'm just going to click on this plus icon to increase my version number, and hit Save As. I can now hide my coral, and then it's time to bring in the reference images that we're going to work from. To do that, I'm going to hit the 1 key on my numpad to jump into front view. Alternatively, you can always use this gizmo up in the top right here. Then simply navigate to wherever you saved your reference file and drag and drop it into the scene. I'm now going to reset its position. So with the reference object selected, I'm just going to hit Alt-G to reset its position to 0. Then in the Properties panel, I'm going to go down to this Object Data Properties tab, and I'm going to enable opacity and drop this value down to 0.1. This will allow us to see through the image as we're working. And then I'm going to hit the G key to grab and X to constrain it to my X-axis and just center this up as best as possible. I'm now going to hit the 3 key on my numpad to jump over into the side view, hit Shift D and right click to cancel the move, and then I'm going to rotate this. So I'm going to R to rotate. We want to constrain the rotation to the Z axis, so I'm going to hit Z and then type in 90 to rotate it 90 degrees and hit enter. I can then G and Y to translate this along the Y axis, and I'm going to roughly center this up along this Z axis line here. Now as we rotate around, you'll see we have these two reference objects positioned. And what I'm also going to do is select this one for the front view, and I'm just going to translate it back along the Y axis now. So G and Y, let's just move it back a little bit. And this one for the side view, let's move that a little bit further out. So G and X to move that back. That way they're not going to overlap with any object that we're working on here in the middle. But if we jump into either the front or the side views, you can see that everything is still aligned nicely. Finally, what I'd like to do is select both of these empty objects here up in the outliner, and then I'm going to hit the M key to create a new collection, which we're going to call reference. This will allow us to easily toggle this on and off. And additionally, I'm just going to go up to the filters option up at the top here, enable this selection filters, and that way I can turn off selection for this entire collection. That way we won't be able to accidentally select and move this reference as we're working. So I'm going to hit Ctrl S to save, and then we can start working on our seahorse in the next lesson. In our past lessons, we started out sculpting from a primitive object such as a sphere. And we could easily do exactly the same thing here as we're starting to sculpt our seahorse. But sometimes a simpler way to work is to start out with a base mesh. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to define the basic overall shape of the seahorse with simple modeling tools, and then we'll start to refine it with our sculpting tools afterwards. So to start out, I'm just going to click on this collection up at the top here to make sure that any new object I add is added under this collection rather than under the reference collection. And then we're going to hit Shift A, and we're just going to add in a cube. I'm going to jump over into my modeling tab here, and then I'm going to go into the right view with the numpad 3, and I'm going to enable X-ray mode, which you can do from the top here or use the Alt-Z shortcut key. This means that any selection that we do of points will select right the way through the object rather than just selecting the closest points to us. Now I'm just going to start moving these vertices around to roughly position them around the head. So initially I'm just going to drag select over these points in the top corner here, just hit G and move them up to the top here. I'll do the same at the front, down at the bottom here. I'm initially just going to form this base shape here. I'm now going to jump into my front view with the 1 key on the numpad, and we're going to select all of these vertices here, and I'm going to scale them in on the x-axis. And we do that just by hitting S and X and scale them in to roughly the proportions of the head there. Now I'm just going to select this front face here, so I'm going to hit 3 to enter face selection mode, deselect everything and select that front face. I'm going to hit E to extrude it a short way and S to scale it down. Now if I jump into my side view again, I'm just going to drag this down and scale it further till it's roughly at the right size. And then we can hit E to extrude it once more. And I'm just going to bring that out to the front here, scale it up again and rotate it. I'm not going for detail at this point. I'm just going for the overall shape. Now I'm going to hit Ctrl R to add an edge loop and add it in the middle of this face here. Just hit right mouse button to cancel that move. Hit 1 just to go back into our vertex select, and I'm just going to move some of these points around again to better define the front of this face here. Remember, we're just going for something that roughly follows the main shape of the head without going into too much detail at this point. I'm going to pull that back for now, and I think I'm going to select this face on the back and again extrude this out. So I'll extrude it a short way, E to extrude, S to scale that down, and again let's go into the side view so that we can move that up and into place. Just rotate it slightly as well there. The other thing I'd like to do is just scale in the top ever so slightly here. So I'm just going to select these top faces, S and X, just to narrow it up a little bit at the top here so we have a bit more form to the top of the head. And I think I'll do the same at the bottom here. Just select this one face on the bottom there and hit S and X to scale that in. There we are. And that should do us for our base shape for our head. So I'm just going to go back into the layout view. We can rename this cube here to head. And go back into our flat shaded mode there as well. Then we'll start working on the body in the next lesson. We're now going to add a new object to form our body. So again, Shift A, and we'll add in another cube. We can just rename this now to body. And once again, let's head into the modeling tab and start working on this base shape. So I'll go into the side view. With all points selected here, I'm just going to scale this right down and move these points so that they are roughly the right shape for this central part of the torso. We can jump to the side and just scale this in slightly on the x-axis. Let's just do that for now. Then I'm going to select this top face here. Let's extrude that out and move it back and scale it down. Just going to roughly form the shape of this neck here. I'm just going to rotate that slightly as well. And then we can extrude that again. Once again, let's rotate it, move it into position, let's scale, and do the same once more. Rotate that and move it into place. Just going to grab these vertices at the back here and let's just nudge them down a bit as well. So we're getting a nicer edge flow here. Bring these ones up. So these come out towards these spines on the back here in each case. Should do. Lift this up a little bit. There we are. Now I'm going to grab this bottom face again here. So 3 to go into face select. Back to the side view and let's extrude that one out. Again, rotate and scale as we go. Extruding again and scaling that down. Let's just select all of these vertices, move them back into place a bit. Come on, there's a little bit more. Again, let's extrude, rotate, scale, and we can continue this on down the rest of the tail as well. We don't have to be too exact, but the closer we keep to the reference here, the easier it will be when we go into sculpt mode. There we are. And let's just have a look around from the front. We'll scale some of these in slightly on the x-axis, just to make sure that we are keeping to that shape that's already been defined. And then I think we can scale that neck in a little bit further as well. So that tapers down up towards the top. There we are. And we've already got a good base shape to work with here. The next thing I'd like to do is just add a tiny bit more detail to this. So I'm going to select the body. Let's go back into modeling mode. I'm going to add another loop down the side here. So Control R and click, right click to cancel the move. And then I'm going to select these back faces here. So let's go into the side view here. And I'm just going to select all of these vertices down the back there, and we're going to just jump to front view, and I'm going to scale these in slightly on the x-axis, so we have a bit of a tapering effect towards the back there. And then we can also do a similar thing with some of these points at the front. I'm going to do the front of the neck there and leave the chest as it is, so that's quite square. But I'm going to just scale these in slightly on the x-axis so it rounds out the neck and the tail a little bit. Let's jump back into layout mode, see what we've got. And then I think we can do a similar thing with the head, so I'm just going to select that, back into modeling, and again let's add an edge loop around the middle here. So let's hit Control R, drop an edge loop in there, and this will just help us to define that volume just a little bit better. So with that selected, I'm just going to hit S and X, just scale it out a little bit on the x-axis to round out that form a touch. If I just hit Alt and click on this edge up at the top here, and then hold Shift and Alt, I can select the edge on the other side as well, and let's just scale them in again slightly on the x-axis. There we are. And go back into layout mode. I think that gives us enough definition as a starting point. So I'm going to save my scene there, and we can start working on the head in the next lesson. With our base mesh now defined, we're going to start working on the head. And we just need a little bit more resolution to work with, because as we've already seen, trying to sculpt on something that's so low resolution is not going to work for us. So I'm just going to jump quickly into the modeling tab here, hit A to select all of the vertices, and right click to subdivide. And I think we're going to do that one more time so that we have a lot more points here to work with. So we can now jump over onto the sculpting tab. And we can start to refine this shape here. So to start with, we just head over to the front here. Just going to hit Alt-Z so that we can see through the mesh briefly. We need to start pushing some of these points around. And what I don't want to do is work on one side of the mesh independently from the other. So we're going to use the symmetry mode up at the top here. So by clicking on that little X icon, it now means that we'll be working on both sides at the same time. So I'm just going to increase my brush size a little and start pushing and pulling on some of these vertices just to better get that overall shape working from the front here. So Alt-Z to cancel that X-ray mode, and we can start. And I'm just going to smooth off this shape a little bit. And just referring to the reference as I go, and I'm just going to start pushing and pulling parts around to try and create that base shape. Just going to lift this up a little bit here at the back and pull it in quite a way. And I'm going to pull the back of this head up and in a little bit here as well, where the neck attaches. So I want to create the effect of these pieces coming out of the back here. So I'm going to pull some of this back in. Not going to get too detailed just yet because we are still fairly low on the amount of geometry that we have, so we can create the overall shape of the head as best as possible, and then we can add the details as we go. We're going to need a little bit of space here for the eyes to keep the front of that quite rounded. The side view and see what we've got. See, got quite a way away from that reference. So let's pull some of these bits up, create the right overall shape. Pull this back a little bit and define those cheeks a bit better. Let's adjust my brush size a bit. We don't have quite enough geometry to work with at the back here, so we'll refine that in a minute. Let's look from the front. So again, let's pull some of this geometry out a little bit, just making little smaller tweaks to refine that overall head shape. And obviously we need to go out a bit towards the back here. Let's pull that in, create that overall shape. And one thing you have to be careful of if you're working in front and side views is that things don't get off on the rest of the mesh. We need the shapes to work in 3 dimensions. So it's important to keep moving around the rest of the sculpt. You can see things have got crushed in a bit at the front here. So we actually want this central area to come out a little bit more, so that it's actually rounded. And we'll be pulling these areas back a little bit to create that correct form. We can always keep jumping back to the side to check. And if you want to see this reference over the top, what we can actually do, if I just jump back into the layout mode, actually, so we're in object mode and go into the reference. If we select either of these, we can adjust how they display. So if we go up to the object properties here and down to the viewport display tab, we can click on in front, and that should allow it to display in front of everything else. And we'll do that on the other one as well. That way, if we now head back into our sculpting mode, we can actually see this image layered over the top of our sculpt here. Just makes it a little bit easier to define this shape. One thing to be careful of actually there is I had the empty still selected rather than my head object. So I'm going to select my head object again here in object mode and jump back into sculpting mode here. And you can see now our sculpt tools are once again available, which will help us to pull these points around and more accurately define this overall form here. Pull these points up a little bit. Again, we need to pull that front out a touch. Let's smooth some of these edges off a little bit, remember, just by holding down the shift key as we're working, trying to create these sort of full cheeks out to the side here. We'll be pushing out space for where the eyes go as we add a little bit more detail in. We keep the front of that nose quite rounded. Just soften off the edges. And just double check every now and again with our reference. I want these pieces to feel like they're rounded and moving back as we go back along the head, creating nice flow of the edges just there. And obviously we don't have enough geometry at the back here, so we're going to refine that in the next lesson.